The silence in my boss's office lasted exactly 8 seconds. I counted each one as I watched his face transform from smug confidence to utter disbelief. The spreadsheet I'd slid across his desk contained numbers that would haunt him for years to come. Numbers that would cost Meridian Solutions exactly $22,476,891. Numbers that never would have come to light if he hadn't fired me 3 months earlier to trim the fat. This can't be right. Richard stammered, his manicured fingers trembling as they hovered over the document. I smiled, not the polite, professional smile I'd worn for 7 years while building his company's financial framework from scratch. This was different. The smile of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. "Oh, it's right," I replied, leaning back in the chair across from his desk. "I triple-checked the calculations. That's kind of my thing, remember?" My name is Samantha Wells, and until 94 days ago, I was the Chief Financial Officer at Meridian Solutions. Now I was something else entirely, the architect of Richard Thompson's downfall. Let me take you back to where it all began. I remember the exact moment I realized my dedication to Meridian Solutions meant nothing to the company's leadership. It was a Tuesday morning in February, unseasonably cold even for Boston. I'd arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m. as usual, my travel mug filled with the strong black coffee that fueled my pre-dawn financial reviews. The quarterly reports were due to the board in 3 days, and I was meticulously verifying every figure, every projection, every potential risk. That's who I was, thorough, precise, cautious. 7 years earlier, when Meridian was just a promising tech startup with more ambition than capital, Richard had hired me specifically for those qualities. "Sam," he'd said during my interview, leaning forward with the intensity that had charmed countless investors, "I need someone who sees the numbers others miss, someone who can build us a financial fortress while we scale." I delivered exactly that. By my second year, I'd restructured our debt, negotiated favorable terms with suppliers, and implemented financial safeguards that protected us during an industry-wide downturn. By year 4, I'd helped guide Meridian through its successful IPO, transforming it from a scrappy startup to a publicly traded company valued at over $200 million. But corporate success has a way of changing people. The Richard who once valued financial prudence had gradually morphed into someone obsessed with aggressive growth metrics and quarter-to-quarter stock performance. Our executive meetings, once collaborative problem-solving sessions, had devolved into Richard demanding ways to juice the numbers while dismissing my concerns about sustainability. On that February morning, I was deep in spreadsheets when my office door swung open without a knock. Richard walked in, followed by a woman I'd never seen before. She wore an expensive charcoal suit and carried a leather portfolio embossed with the logo of Wellington Partners, one of the management consulting firms known for orchestrating corporate efficiency restructuring, the euphemism du jour for mass layoffs. "Morning, Sam," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is Diane from Wellington. She'll need access to all our departmental budgets and personnel files." I looked up from my computer. I wasn't aware we'd engaged Wellington. Is this related to the acquisition we discussed last month? "Not exactly," Richard replied, glancing at his watch. "It's more of a comprehensive operational review. Diane will explain everything. I've got a call with Tokyo in 5 minutes." Before I could ask another question, he was gone, leaving me with a stranger who was apparently being given unfettered access to financial information I guarded zealously. "Mr. Thompson has authorized full disclosure," Diane said, sliding a document across my desk. "We'll need to move quickly. My team is already setting up in Conference Room C." The document was a consulting agreement signed the previous week, without my knowledge, despite the fact that all major expenditures required CFO approval according to our corporate bylaws. Even more concerning was the scope of work: comprehensive organizational restructuring and cost-basis realignment. "You're here to cut jobs," I said, looking up from the document. Diane's professional mask didn't slip. "We're here to help Meridian optimize its human capital deployment in alignment with strategic priorities." That's a very expensive way to say fire people, I replied. And as CFO, I can tell you that Wellington's fees alone will offset any short-term savings from staff reductions. Ms. Wells, Diane said, her voice cooling several degrees. This initiative comes directly from the CEO and has board approval. Our analysis will be thorough and objective. Now, about those files. For the next 2 weeks, Wellington's consultants swarmed our offices, conducting interviews, demanding reports, and creating an atmosphere of dread throughout the company. Employees whispered in break rooms and sent concerned messages about seeing colleagues ushered to HR. Productivity plummeted. Not that the consultants seemed to measure that particular metric. I voiced my concerns to Richard repeatedly, both about the process and the lack of transparency. This isn't just about numbers, I argued during one particularly heated meeting. We're disrupting the culture we've spent years building. People are terrified, not focused. Sometimes you need to break things to rebuild them stronger, Richard replied, repeating what sounded like a Wellington catchphrase. The market doesn't reward sentimentality, Sam, it rewards results. And how exactly are we measuring these results? I pressed. Wellington's metrics don't account for knowledge loss, reduced innovation, or damage to our employer brand. Richard waved away my concerns. That's all soft stuff. Wellington has done this for dozens of companies bigger than ours. Trust the process. The process reached its conclusion on a Friday afternoon. Department heads were called one by one to the executive conference room to receive their staff reduction targets. When my turn came, I arrived with a detailed analysis showing how cutting my already lean finance team would create significant compliance risks and ultimately cost more than it saved. I never got the chance to present it. Sam, we're going in a different direction with finance, Richard said, not quite meeting my eyes. Diane sat beside him, her expression unreadable. What different direction? I asked, though a cold realization was already spreading through my chest. We've identified opportunities to streamline the entire finance function, he said, using the distant, rehearsed language of corporate downsizing. In reviewing our executive structure, we've determined that the CFO role can be eliminated, with key responsibilities distributed to other leaders or managed through outsourced services. For a moment, I couldn't speak. 7 years of 80-hour weeks, of canceled vacations and missed family events, of building Meridian's financial systems from nothing, all reduced to an opportunity to streamline. You're firing me, I finally said, my voice steady despite the shock. After everything I've built here, Richard shifted uncomfortably. We're eliminating the position, not the person. Your contribution has been. Save the HR script, I interrupted. At least have the decency to be straightforward. What's the real reason, Richard? My department is the most efficient in the company by every metric. A flicker of genuine emotion, something between guilt and irritation, crossed his face. The board wants to see bold action on expenses. Your team's headcount is small, but the executive compensation line is a big target. This isn't personal. It's entirely personal to me, I replied. And it's financially reckless. But then, that's becoming your specialty, isn't it? Richard's expression hardened. You'll receive 6 months severance, which is generous given the circumstances. HR has your paperwork ready. They'll need your laptop and security badge before you leave. And just like that, after 7 years of building Meridian Solutions into a financial powerhouse, I was escorted from the building by security, carrying only my purse and a small plant from my desk. My company phone was confiscated, my email access terminated, my employee badge deactivated, nearly a decade of my professional life erased in less than an hour. I walked to my car in a daze, the March wind cutting through my blazer. Only when I was safely inside with the doors locked did I allow myself a moment of raw emotion. A single, gasping sob that carried all the shock, betrayal, and humiliation of the day. Then I took a deep breath, started the engine, and made a decision. This wasn't over. Most people, when unfairly fired, fantasize briefly about revenge before moving on with their lives. They update their resumes, reach out to their networks, and channel their energy into finding a new position. That would have been the sensible approach. But something about the callousness of my dismissal, the casual discarding of my contributions, the betrayal by someone I'd helped make wealthy, ignited something deeper than mere anger. It was as if Richard had awakened a part of me I'd never known existed, a strategist capable of ice-cold calculation, unencumbered by corporate loyalty or professional niceties. I spent that weekend in a strange state of calm productivity. I didn't call friends to complain or family to seek comfort. Instead, I created a detailed timeline of my tenure at Meridian, identifying key projects, decisions, and financial structures I'd implemented. I reviewed confidentiality clauses in my employment contract and severance agreement, carefully noting what they prohibited and, more importantly, what they didn't. By Sunday evening, I had transformed my home office into a war room, with notes covering the walls and spreadsheets open on multiple screens. I wasn't just planning my next career move, I was plotting a precision strike against the company that had discarded me, and the man who had made the decision. The strategy required patience. While my severance provided financial breathing room, I needed to appear focused on traditional job-seeking activities. I updated my LinkedIn profile, responded to recruiters, and even took a few interviews. To anyone watching, including Richard or his remaining executives, I was doing exactly what they expected, trying to salvage my career after an unexpected setback. Behind this carefully constructed facade, however, I was laying the groundwork for something entirely different. The first phase involved gathering intelligence. While I no longer had direct access to Meridian systems, I had something potentially more valuable: relationships with people who did. For 7 years, I'd built a reputation for fairness and professionalism among Meridian's staff. I'd defended departments from budget cuts, advocated for raises, and treated everyone from executive assistants to senior directors with equal respect. These connections proved invaluable. Former colleagues reached out with sympathy messages, and in those conversations, I gently gathered information. How was the transition going? Who had absorbed my duties? Were there any challenges with the new financial structure? Without explicitly asking for confidential information, I pieced together a picture of post-Sam Meridian. What emerged was exactly what I'd predicted: chaos. Richard had distributed my responsibilities among 3 unprepared department heads while outsourcing critical financial functions to a third-party firm with no understanding of Meridian's complex business model. The quarterly SEC filing, my last had been submitted just before my termination, was now dangerously behind schedule. With auditors raising concerns about data consistency, the second phase of my plan required more direct action. Through industry contacts, I learned that Meridian was pursuing an acquisition of NextCore Technologies, a smaller competitor with a complementary product line. Under normal circumstances, I would have led the financial due diligence for such a deal, meticulously uncovering any hidden liabilities or risks. Without my oversight, Meridian was vulnerable, especially given a peculiarity in NextCore's financial structure that I had identified years earlier. During a competitive analysis I'd conducted in 2019, I discovered that NextCore had a convoluted licensing agreement with their primary technology provider that included a massive balloon payment triggered by any change in corporate control. This poison pill was buried so deeply in their financial statements that only someone with specialized knowledge would spot it. It had prevented me from recommending NextCore as an acquisition target previously, a fact documented in a memo I'd sent to Richard 3 years earlier, which he had apparently forgotten. Now, with Richard rushing to make a splashy acquisition to boost Meridian's stock price, this overlooked detail could become the perfect trap. The third phase was the most delicate: positioning myself to benefit from Meridian's impending mistake. This required careful navigation of securities laws and my confidentiality agreements. After consulting with an attorney, hypothetically, of course, I identified a legal approach. I wouldn't short Meridian's stock directly, which could raise red flags. Instead, I established a complex options strategy that would yield significant returns if Meridian's stock experienced unusual volatility. Additionally, I identified several Meridian competitors who would be strengthened by Meridian's distraction and potential financial strain. With my strategy in place, I watched and waited as Richard and his new financial team blundered forward with the acquisition. Press releases touted the strategic synergies and market expansion opportunities without a hint of the financial disaster lurking beneath the surface. The deal closed on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Nextcore's technology provider had triggered the change of control clause, demanding immediate payment of $18 million that Meridian hadn't budgeted for. By Monday morning, Meridian's stock had plunged 28% as the market reacted to the unexpected financial hit. By Wednesday, the SEC had opened an inquiry into whether Meridian had failed to disclose material information to shareholders. All of this unfolded exactly as I had anticipated. My options strategy yielded a seven-figure return, while my investments in Meridian's competitors appreciated significantly as they gained market share during Meridian's crisis. But the most satisfying moment came 3 months after my firing, when Richard's assistant called to request an urgent meeting. "Mr. Thompson would like to meet as soon as possible," she said, her voice tight with strain. "He says it's regarding a consulting opportunity that would be very generously compensated." Which brings us back to the moment I described at the beginning, sitting across from Richard in his office, watching him stare at the spreadsheet detailing exactly how much his decision to fire me had cost the company. "You knew," he finally said, looking up from the document. "You knew about the Nextcore situation." I maintained my composure. I analyzed Nextcore as a potential acquisition target 3 years ago and documented the issues in my report. It's all in the corporate records, assuming Wellington's restructuring didn't eliminate the institutional knowledge along with the people who had it. Richard ran a hand through his hair, now noticeably grayer than it had been 3 months earlier. "The board is calling for my resignation. Major shareholders are threatening lawsuits. We need someone who understands our financial structure to help navigate this mess." He leaned forward. "I'm prepared to offer you a consulting contract at 3 times your previous salary, 6-month minimum engagement, with a success bonus if you can help us recover." I allowed myself a small smile. "That's an interesting proposal." "We need you, Sam," Richard said, desperation creeping into his voice. "You're the only one who fully understands the complexities of our financial framework." "You're right about that," I replied calmly. "I built that framework. And then you decided it wasn't worth keeping me around to maintain it." "That was a mistake," he admitted with visible difficulty. "A serious misjudgment that I regret." I studied him for a moment, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the new lines of stress around his mouth. In the silence, I considered the offer. The compensation was substantial. Vindication in the form of a significant payday. It would be easy to accept, to position myself as the savior of the company I'd helped build. But that wasn't the victory I wanted. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline," I said, standing and gathering my belongings. "I've accepted a position as CFO at Vantage Systems." The color drained from Richard's face. Vantage was Meridian's largest competitor, and with my intimate knowledge of Meridian's operations, I would be an invaluable asset to them. "You can't," he began. "I can, and I have." I interrupted. My non-compete expired with my termination, as clearly stated in Section 23B of my original employment agreement. A detail that might have been caught had your Wellington consultants understood the actual contracts they were terminating. Richard looked stricken. "Sam, please. The company won't survive this without you." I paused at the door of his office. "That sounds like exactly the sort of soft metric you weren't concerned about 3 months ago. Perhaps Wellington can help you quantify that loss." As I walked through Meridian's offices for the last time, former colleagues stared with a mixture of awe and apprehension. News of the Nextcore disaster had rippled through the company, along with whispers that I had somehow predicted it. By the time I reached the elevator, I could already see people huddled in concerned groups, no doubt discussing what my appearance might mean. The following week, Richard was indeed forced to resign. Meridian stock fell another 15% on the news of my joining Vantage. Within 6 months, what remained of Meridian was acquired by a private equity firm at a fraction of its former valuation, its name and products absorbed into a larger conglomerate. As for me, my career at Vantage flourished. With my guidance, we captured much of Meridian's market share and expanded into new territories. My reputation as both a financial strategist and someone not to be underestimated spread throughout the industry. Occasionally, I encountered former Meridian employees at industry events. Some avoided eye contact, perhaps feeling I had contributed to the company's downfall. Others approached with a certain cautious respect, wondering if the rumors of my calculated revenge were true. I never confirmed or denied those rumors. There was no need. The results spoke for themselves. Richard's decision to trim the fat by eliminating my position had ultimately cost Meridian $22 million in direct losses from the next core debacle, plus hundreds of millions more in market capitalization and the company's eventual independence. The lesson was written in red across Meridian's final quarterly statements. Some costs can't be measured on a Wellington consultant's spreadsheet, and some people shouldn't be treated as mere budget items to be eliminated when convenient. Late one evening, about a year after Meridian's acquisition, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. It contained only a short message. "You were right. I should have listened." I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I closed my laptop and gazed out at the Boston skyline from my new corner office at Vantage, an office considerably larger than Richard's had been. On my desk sat the small plant I'd carried out of Meridian on my last day, now thriving in its new environment. Just like its owner, I sometimes wonder if Richard ever truly understood what happened. Did he realize that firing me wasn't just a financial miscalculation, but a fundamental misreading of who I was? Did he recognize that by treating loyalty as a disposable commodity, he had transformed a dedicated ally into a formidable adversary? Perhaps not. Men like Richard rarely learn such lessons. They simply move on to the next company, the next round of strategic restructuring, the next batch of dedicated employees to be discarded when convenient. But in boardrooms and executive suites across Boston, my story has become something of a legend, a cautionary tale whispered to CEOs considering similar cost-cutting measures. Remember what happened at Meridian, they say? Sometimes the most expensive decision you can make is firing the wrong person to save money. As for me, I no longer define myself by that chapter of my career. The revenge that once consumed my thoughts now seems distant, a necessary but completed phase. I've built something new at Vantage, something stronger and more sustainable than what existed at Meridian. But I keep that spreadsheet, the one that documented the $22 million cost of Richard's decision, framed on my office wall. Not as a trophy or a reminder of past grievances, but as evidence of a simple truth. In business, as in life, how you treat people matters. It matters on the balance sheet, it matters in the market, and sometimes it matters in ways you never anticipated until it's too late to change course. Richard learned that lesson at a cost of $22 million. I learned something more valuable, that my worth wasn't defined by a title or a company, but by the knowledge, skills, and relationships I'd built along the way. In the end, Richard didn't just fire his CFO to save money, he created his most expensive adversary and taught her exactly how much power she truly had. 3 years have passed since Meridian's collapse. Vantage has prospered under my financial leadership, our market capitalization tripling as we absorbed former Meridian clients and expanded into new territories. I've been profiled in business magazines, invited to speak at industry conferences, and approached about board positions at several Fortune 500 companies. Success, as they say, is the best revenge. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments between meetings or late at night reviewing quarterly projections, I reflect on the journey that brought me here, not with bitterness or lingering resentment, but with a clear-eyed assessment of the lessons learned. I think about the hundreds of Meridian employees whose careers were disrupted when the company was acquired and gutted, the engineers who had built innovative products, the sales teams who had cultivated client relationships, the administrative staff who had kept everything running smoothly. My revenge against Richard had collateral damage I hadn't fully considered in my focused pursuit of justice. This realization led me to establish a private foundation funded from my Vantage compensation and investment returns. The new Foundation's initiative provides grants and mentoring to professionals displaced by corporate restructuring, helping them retrain or launch their own ventures. Several former Meridian employees now lead successful startups backed by the Foundation, creating jobs and building something positive from the ashes of our shared experience. Richard, I heard, struggled to find another CEO position after Meridian's collapse. The stain of such a spectacular failure proved difficult to overcome, especially in Boston's tight-knit business community where reputation travels fast and memory runs long. After several years of consulting work, the corporate equivalent of exile, he eventually landed a role leading a small tech firm in the Midwest, far from the centers of industry influence. I saw him once, about 2 years after Meridian's acquisition, at an airport lounge in Chicago. He was alone, scrolling through his phone with the distracted intensity of someone avoiding their surroundings. I considered approaching him, not to gloat or reminisce, but perhaps to close that chapter with some final word of professional acknowledgement. In the end, I simply watched him board his flight to Des Moines, our paths diverging just as decisively as they had that day in his office. Whatever conversation might have occurred between us seemed unnecessary by then. We had both moved on to different lives, shaped irrevocably by the decisions made during those pivotal months. My office at Vantage now contains no mementos from Meridian, not even the spreadsheet I once displayed. I donated the small desk plant to a community garden. The past remains instructive but no longer defines my daily thoughts or professional identity. Instead, my focus has shifted to building something sustainable at Vantage. When Wellington Partners inevitably approached our CEO with promises of operational efficiencies, I presented a comprehensive analysis demonstrating how their proposed cuts would damage our innovation pipeline and institutional knowledge. The proposal was rejected. We've seen how that story ends. Our CEO told the Wellington representatives, "Just ask Richard Thompson." The truest form of victory, I've discovered, isn't in destruction, but in creation. Building systems and cultures that value people as more than line items on a cost-cutting spreadsheet. My experience with Richard and Meridian taught me not just how to exact a precise revenge, but ultimately how to lead with both financial acumen and human understanding. Last month, I was offered the CEO position at Vantage following our current chief's retirement announcement. After careful consideration, I accepted. My first communication to the company emphasized my commitment to growth that doesn't come at the expense of our people or our values. Financial strength and human capital aren't competing interests. I wrote in my acceptance statement, they're interdependent assets that, when properly aligned, create sustainable value for all stakeholders. Some might see this philosophy as the hard-won wisdom of someone who experienced corporate betrayal firsthand. Others might view it as simple business sense, backed by research showing that companies with high employee engagement outperform their competitors. For me, it's both, a professional principle informed by personal experience. As I prepare to step into my new role, I sometimes wonder what advice I would give to the Samantha Wells of 3 years ago, sitting shocked in her car after being escorted from Meridian's offices. Would I counsel patience instead of revenge? Suggest a different path that might have preserved Meridian while still holding Richard accountable? Perhaps. But I also recognize that sometimes we need to walk through fire to emerge stronger on the other side. My journey from discarded CFO to respected CEO wasn't linear or entirely pretty, but it was necessary, both for my professional evolution and for the industry lessons it generated. In Boston's corporate circles, executives now think twice before eliminating key positions for short-term savings. The Meridian effect, they call it, the potentially catastrophic cost of valuing quarterly numbers over institutional knowledge and loyal talent. Richard's $22 million mistake became a case study taught in business schools, analyzed by management consultants, and cited in corporate boardrooms. In that sense, his error continues to generate value, though not in the way he intended. As for me, I've found something better than revenge: perspective. The power to shape corporate culture from the top, to demonstrate that financial discipline and human dignity can coexist, to build something that might outlast my tenure and influence industry practices beyond my immediate reach. On my first day as CEO, I'll bring a new plant for my office, not as a symbol of survival or transformation, but as a reminder of growth's fundamental requirements: solid roots, regular nourishment, and the patience to cultivate something that endures. Richard's decision to fire me to save money ultimately cost Meridian $22 million and its corporate existence. My decision to move beyond revenge has yielded something far more valuable: the opportunity to create lasting change in how companies value their most important assets, their people. That's a return on investment worth celebrating. 6 months into my tenure as Vantage's CEO, Businessweek requested an interview for a feature on corporate comeback stories. The journalist was particularly interested in my transition from Meridian's ousted CFO to Vantage's chief executive. Looking back, she asked toward the end of our conversation, "Do you think Richard Thompson realizes exactly how much his decision cost him?" I considered the question carefully. The financial calculations are straightforward: the immediate $22 million loss from the Nextcore acquisition mistake, plus Meridian's collapsed market value. But the true cost goes beyond numbers. He lost the company he built, his professional reputation, and the trust of hundreds of people who had committed their careers to his vision. "And what did you gain, beyond your current position?" she pressed. "Clarity," I replied. "About my value, certainly. But more importantly, about the kind of leader I wanted to become." Sometimes our most painful professional moments create our most valuable opportunities for growth, if we're willing to learn from them. The article, published under the headline, "The $22 million Firing: How One CEO's Cost-Cutting Created His Greatest Competitor," generated significant industry discussion. I received hundreds of messages from professionals sharing similar experiences of corporate devaluation and subsequent reinvention. These stories reinforced my commitment to a different leadership approach at Vantage. We implemented expanded professional development programs, transparent promotion pathways, and robust internal communication channels. Our executive compensation became tied not just to financial metrics, but to employee retention and satisfaction benchmarks. The results spoke for themselves. Within 2 years, our voluntary turnover dropped by 34%, while innovation metrics and market share continued to climb. Industry analysts began describing the Vantage model as a competitive advantage in talent acquisition and retention. Richard, I heard, read the Businessweek article. A former Meridian colleague who occasionally consulted for his new company mentioned that he kept a copy in his desk drawer, though whether as motivation or warning remained unclear. Perhaps both. The most expensive lessons often serve dual purposes in our professional development. As Vantage continued to thrive under my leadership, I occasionally reflected on the strange symmetry of my career journey. Richard had fired me to save money, inadvertently creating the circumstances that would cost him everything while propelling me toward greater success than I might otherwise have achieved. There's an ancient proverb about being careful when digging graves for your enemies, lest you fall into them yourself. Richard had intended to eliminate a budget line. Instead, he had created his most formidable adversary, and ultimately, his replacement in the industry hierarchy. The irony wasn't lost on me, neither was the responsibility that came with it. Last month, Vantage acquired the small Midwestern tech firm Richard had been leading. The decision was purely strategic. They had developed a proprietary algorithm that complemented our product suite perfectly. The board unanimously approved the acquisition after thorough due diligence, conducted with the meticulous attention to detail I'd learned through painful experience. The question of Richard's future within the newly combined organization fell to me as CEO. In our industry, such acquisitions typically result in leadership redundancies and prompt departures. The poetic justice of terminating Richard's position would have completed the circle of corporate karma that began with my own firing years earlier. Instead, I offered him a senior advisory role focused on the integration of his company's technology, a position that utilized his technical knowledge while keeping him removed from financial and personnel decisions. The contract included specific performance metrics and cultural expectations, with clear consequences for failure to meet either. When I delivered the offer personally, Richard's expression cycled through surprise, suspicion, and cautious relief. "Why?" he asked finally. After everything that happened, you could easily push me out. I could. I agreed. But that would be making the same mistake you made, discarding valuable institutional knowledge for short-term satisfaction. He studied me for a long moment. You're not the same Sam Wells who worked for me at Meridian. No, I replied. I'm the Sam Wells who learned from watching what happened to Meridian. The question is whether you're still the same Richard Thompson who made those decisions. His gaze dropped to the contract on the table between us. I've learned some expensive lessons too. Then prove it, I said, standing to end our meeting. This industry doesn't need more cautionary tales. It needs leaders who understand that the true value of a company isn't found on its balance sheet. As I walked to the door, Richard called after me. For what it's worth, I should have listened to you about NextCore. I paused, turning back with a small smile. Yes, you should have. That would have been the $22 million decision. When I returned to my office, my assistant informed me that the final integration numbers for Richard's company had come in. The projected value creation from the acquisition significantly exceeded our initial estimates, a rare occurrence in an industry known for over-optimistic merger projections. I reviewed the figures with satisfaction. Whatever personal history existed between Richard and me, the acquisition made strategic sense. Sometimes the most powerful business decisions come from separating professional judgment from personal feelings. Another lesson from the Meridian chapter of my career. Later that evening, as I prepared to leave the office, I noticed a small package that had been delivered to my desk. Inside was a potted plant, the same variety as the one I'd carried out of Meridian years earlier, with a note that read simply, "To new growth, RT." I placed the plant on my windowsill beside the thriving greenery that filled my office. A living reminder that even in the cutthroat world of corporate finance, there was always room for renewal, redemption, and second chances. Not because they were deserved, necessarily, but because offering them was the kind of leader I had chosen to become. The $22 million lesson had been expensive for everyone involved. The true test of its value would be in how it shaped our actions moving forward, in what we built from the understanding it provided. That night, I added a final personal note to the draft of Vantage's annual shareholder letter. Our greatest assets walk out the door every evening and choose to return each morning. Our continued success depends not just on what we build, but on who builds it with us. This principle guides every decision we make, from product development to acquisitions to internal investment. It wasn't just corporate philosophy. It was the hard-won wisdom of someone who had experienced firsthand both sides of the equation, the cost of being undervalued and the power of recognizing true worth, both organizational and personal. Richard had fired me to save money and lost $22 million in the process. I had turned that loss into something more valuable, a blueprint for leadership that balanced financial discipline with human dignity. In the complex calculus of corporate value, that might be the most important equation of all. 1 year after Richard joined Vantage in his advisory role, I received a message from our HR director. Richard had submitted his resignation, effective in 30 days. Attached was a business plan for a nonprofit he intended to launch, an organization dedicated to helping displaced tech workers rebuild their careers through mentorship, training, and networking support. The concept mirrored my own New Foundations initiative, though with a structure that leveraged Richard's particular expertise and industry connections. He was seeking neither funding nor approval, merely extending the professional courtesy of advance notice before his departure. I studied the business plan with interest. It was thorough, financially sound, and addressed a genuine need in our industry. More significantly, it represented a fundamental shift in Richard's approach to human capital, from seeing people as expendable resources to recognizing them as valuable assets worthy of investment even after their organizational utility had ended. I requested a meeting before his departure. Your nonprofit concept is impressive, I told him when we met in my office the following week, particularly the emphasis on preserving institutional knowledge through formalized knowledge transfer processes. Richard nodded. I've been thinking about what you said when you acquired my company, about the value not found on balance sheets. There's an entire ecosystem of expertise that gets lost in the constant shuffling of tech talent. Companies pay for the same lessons over and over because there's no mechanism for preserving what was learned. Like the lesson of overlooking critical details in an acquisition target's licensing agreements, I asked with a raised eyebrow. A rueful smile crossed his face. Among others. The next core situation cost me more than money. It cost me the company I built, my reputation, and a decade of my life's work. That's not something you forget. I studied him for a moment, noting the changes time had wrought. The arrogance that had once defined him had been replaced with something more thoughtful, perhaps even humble. So this nonprofit is your way of making amends? I asked. Not exactly, Richard replied, leaning forward. It's my way of creating something valuable from an expensive education. The tech industry burns through talent with little regard for the human and intellectual capital that's lost in the process. I was part of that problem. Now I'd like to be part of a solution. The irony wasn't lost on me, that Richard's greatest contribution to the industry might come not from the company he'd built and lost, but from the lessons he'd learned in losing it. There was a certain poetic justice in that transformation. Vantage would be interested in becoming a founding corporate sponsor, I said after a moment's consideration, with some conditions regarding metrics, transparency, and board composition. Surprise flickered across his face. You'd support this? Professionally. It aligns with our corporate values around human capital development, I replied. And personally? Well, let's just say I understand the value of reinvention better than most. After Richard left my office, I stood at the window overlooking Boston's skyline, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought us both to this point. From adversaries locked in corporate combat to reluctant collaborators in creating something potentially more meaningful than either of our previous achievements. The press release announcing Vantage's sponsorship of Richard's nonprofit generated significant industry attention. Several tech publications noted the unlikely partnership between a CEO and the executive who had once fired her, framing it as a case study in professional evolution and corporate responsibility. At the nonprofit's launch event 6 months later, a reporter asked the inevitable question, given your history, how did this collaboration come about? Richard glanced at me before responding. Sometimes the most valuable partnerships emerge from the most expensive mistakes. The question isn't whether you fail. Everyone does eventually. The question is what you build from that failure. I nodded in agreement. In business as in life, the true measure of success isn't avoiding setbacks. It's how you respond to them, what you learn, how you grow, and ultimately what you create from the experience. As we stood side by side for the ceremonial ribbon cutting, I reflected on how differently this story might have ended. Had I remained consumed by revenge, had Richard persisted in his old approach to leadership, we both might have missed the opportunity to create something more valuable than either of us could have built alone. The nonprofit's first year exceeded all projections, helping over 200 displaced tech workers find new positions or launch their own ventures. Its knowledge preservation framework was adopted by several major companies, creating more stable career pathways in an industry notorious for volatility. On the anniversary of my firing from Meridian, I received an email from Richard with a single attachment, a framed photograph of the nonprofit's first graduating class. 38 tech professionals who had rebuilt their careers after corporate restructuring. The message read simply, a better return on investment. I smiled, saving the image to my personal files. He wasn't wrong. Some forms of capital appreciation can't be measured on quarterly statements or annual reports. Sometimes the most valuable returns emerge from our most painful investments. 2 years into my CEO tenure at Vantage, a major business magazine named me Executive of the Year, citing our company's remarkable growth, innovative human capital strategies, and industry-leading retention rates. The feature article included a sidebar on what they called the Meridian journey, the unlikely path from fired CFO to celebrated CEO. Do you ever regret what happened at Meridian? The interviewer had asked. Regret implies I would choose a different path if given the chance. I replied after consideration, I wouldn't. Every step of that journey, including the painful parts, was necessary to bring me where I am today. The lessons were expensive, but their value has proven immeasurable. The morning after the article was published, I arrived at my office to find dozens of messages from professionals sharing their own stories of career setbacks and eventual triumphs. One in particular caught my attention, an email from a former Meridian engineer who had been part of the post-acquisition layoffs. When Meridian collapsed, I thought my career was over. She wrote, "The nonprofit's mentoring program helped me launch my own consultancy, which now employs 15 people. I've learned that sometimes being pushed off one path forces you to discover a better one. Thank you for showing that professional setbacks don't define us. How we respond to them does." Her words resonated deeply. The revenge I'd once sought against Richard had transformed into something far more meaningful, a platform for helping others navigate their own professional challenges. The $22 million mistake that ended one chapter had funded the beginning of something more valuable than either of us could have anticipated. In my reply to the engineer, I included a quote that had become something of a personal mantra. Success isn't about avoiding failure, it's about failing forward, using each setback as a stepping stone rather than a stopping point. That philosophy now guided Vantage's approach to innovation, talent development, and even our acquisition strategy. We evaluated potential targets not just for their financial metrics, but for their cultural alignment and knowledge assets, the human capital that balance sheets failed to capture, but that ultimately determined long-term success. At our annual leadership retreat, I shared a case study based on Meridian's collapse, carefully anonymized to focus on the structural issues rather than specific individuals. The lessons were clear. Short-term cost-cutting that sacrificed institutional knowledge inevitably created long-term vulnerabilities that competitors could exploit. The most expensive decision a company can make, I told our executive team, is undervaluing its most important assets, the people who build, maintain, and grow the organization daily. When we reduce humans to line items, we create the conditions for our own failure. The presentation generated thoughtful discussion about Vantage's growth strategy and how we might continue scaling without sacrificing the cultural elements that differentiated us in the market. Several executives shared examples of competitors who had fallen into the same trap that had claimed Meridian, pursuing efficiency at the expense of effectiveness, cost-cutting that ultimately proved far more expensive than the initial savings. As the session concluded, our Chief Human Resources Officer raised an interesting point. The Meridian story is ultimately about more than financial miscalculation. It's about the danger of separating business decisions from their human impact. When we dehumanize our operations, we create the conditions for catastrophic failure. I nodded in agreement. Precisely. The $22 million wasn't lost because of a single overlooked contract clause. It was lost because removing the person who understood those complexities created a knowledge vacuum that made the oversight inevitable. People aren't interchangeable parts. They're repositories of invaluable institutional knowledge that walks out the door when they're discarded. Later that evening, I received an unexpected call from Richard. His nonprofit had been approached about a potential merger with a larger industry foundation, a move that would significantly expand their reach and resources. "I wanted your perspective before we proceed," he said, the irony of seeking acquisition advice from me not lost on either of us. Given our history, it seemed appropriate. I laughed softly. Life does have a certain circular quality, doesn't it? Send me the details, and I'll review them. Just promise me you'll read every line of the licensing agreements this time. Twice, he assured me. With outside counsel and a dedicated team. Some lessons you only need to learn once. As I ended the call, I reflected on how profoundly both our professional lives had been transformed by that pivotal firing. Richard had lost a company, but gained a mission. I had lost a position, but found a purpose. The $22 million mistake had ultimately generated value far beyond its cost, not in financial terms, but in the lessons, growth, and positive impact that emerged from its aftermath. The plant Richard had given me continued to thrive in my office, joined now by dozens of others that created a living green wall behind my desk. Visitors often commented on the unusual display in a corporate setting. They remind me of an important truth. I would explain. Growth requires the right conditions, sufficient light, proper nourishment, room to expand. The same principles apply to people and organizations. When we provide the right environment, remarkable things happen. 5 years after my firing from Meridian, I rarely thought about revenge. The anger that had once fueled my strategic response to betrayal had transformed into something more constructive. A commitment to building organizations where such betrayals were neither necessary nor rewarded. Richard's nonprofit and my leadership at Vantage represented different manifestations of the same fundamental realization: that the true cost of treating people as disposable resources extends far beyond severance packages or recruitment expenses. It erodes the foundation of trust, knowledge, and commitment upon which sustainable success is built. The financial industry has a term for investments that appear profitable in the short term but create catastrophic losses over time: toxic assets. Richard's decision to fire me had created exactly that. A transaction that generated immediate savings while sowing the seeds of eventual collapse. My journey from that moment of shock and betrayal to my current position had taught me perhaps the most valuable lesson of my career: that our greatest professional setbacks often contain the seeds of our most significant growth. Not because failure is inherently valuable, but because how we respond to failure reveals and shapes our character in ways that success never could. The spreadsheet that once documented the $22 million cost of Richard's decision no longer hung on my wall. I didn't need that reminder anymore. Instead, my office displayed the annual impact reports from both the nonprofit and Vantage's own foundation. Tangible evidence that even the most painful professional experiences can ultimately yield positive outcomes when channeled constructively. Last week, Richard called to share some news. The merged foundation had received a major grant to expand its programs nationally, potentially helping thousands of displaced tech workers rebuild their careers. The funding announcement specifically cited the organization's unique approach to preserving and transferring institutional knowledge, the very issue that had triggered Meridian's collapse. "I think we finally managed to extract the full value from that $22 million lesson," Richard said, a note of satisfaction in his voice. It was an expensive education. I agreed. But as my grandmother used to say, the only thing more expensive than education is ignorance. After we ended the call, I opened my calendar and made a note for the following week: schedule lunch with Richard to discuss potential collaboration between Vantage and the Foundation on a new industry initiative. Our unusual partnership had evolved from adversaries to reluctant collaborators to something approaching actual colleagues, united by a shared understanding of both what had gone wrong at Meridian and how those lessons might prevent similar failures elsewhere. That evening, as I prepared to leave my office, I paused at the window overlooking Boston's financial district. Somewhere in the glittering landscape of corporate towers, countless professionals were experiencing their own moments of triumph and betrayal, advancement and setback, growth and loss, each creating their own stories of resilience, revenge, or redemption. I hoped some might learn from our expensive mistake rather than repeating it. That was, perhaps, the most valuable return on the $22 million investment: the possibility that others might fail more intelligently, recover more strategically, and ultimately build something better from the experience. As for me, I had long since moved beyond the need for revenge. Richard's decision to fire me had indeed cost him $22 million and his company. But what it had given me, professional growth, personal resilience, and a platform for positive impact, had proven far more valuable than any monetary calculation could capture. Sometimes losing everything is the first step to gaining something better. Sometimes being undervalued creates the opportunity to demonstrate your true worth. And sometimes the path to your greatest professional achievement begins with someone else's most expensive mistake. That, ultimately, is the balance sheet that matters most.